Good evening, and welcome to Skep Talk, the monthly speaker series hosted by the Bay Area Skeptics. Before tonight's presentation, a few words about Bay Area Skeptics. As North America's oldest skeptical organization, we are dedicated to promoting critical thinking, logic, and rational thought. In the 1970s and 80s, scientists such as Carl Sagan and magicians such as James Randi established the scientific skepticism movement out of concern about the popular fondness for pseudoscience and the lack of public science literacy. Scientific skepticism embraces evidence-based civil discourse on health, education, consumer protection, and especially the investigation of extraordinary claims. Using the scientific method, we hope to promote skeptical inquiry to reduce irrational thinking in society. This talk is supported by Bay Area Skeptics members such as you. Please visit us at baskeptics.org or join us on Facebook, Twitter, and Meetup. Consider supporting us through convenient monthly donations via Patreon. Patrons receive premiums such as discounts and free t-shirts for our annual Skeptical Conference. But more importantly, members help us make the world just a little more reasonable and rational. And now, tonight's speaker.
Welcome. My name is Gwen Olson. I'm a board member of the Bay Area Skeptics, and I will be your host. Tonight, we're honored to have with us Dr. Nathan H. Lents, a scientist, university professor, and author of several popular science books. He's a professor on the faculty of New York's John Jay College and noted for his work in genetics and evolution. He has published articles in Skeptic Magazine, Skeptical Inquirer, and is a Committee for Skeptical Inquiry Fellow. Bay Area Skeptics will remember him from his appearances on the online program Skeptical Inquirer Presents and previous appearances with Bay Area Skeptics. He will be speaking tonight on evolution and sexual diversity in the animal world. Welcome back, Dr. Lents.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation. It's always great to be here. I love the Bay Area Skeptics. The first time that I was with this group was in person. I got to be there. And in fact, I think it was in the room that was just on the screen when my first book came out. So 10 years ago. Anyway, it's lovely to be back and talking about everyone's favorite topic, sex. So we're here to talk about sex and sexual diversity. And of course, gender as part of that. And if we're all ready, I'm ready to start.
Let's go.
All right, let's do it. Okay, so there are my slides. So the title of my book is The Sexual Evolution. And I try to basically trace the 500 million years of animals and sex. And it's very important to remember that sexual reproduction, of course, exists in other creatures besides animals. I'm talking about plants and fungi and the various kingdoms of protists. And there's just so much going on with all of those that I decided to stick only with animals because animals are the ones that have that funny thing called behavior. And that's mostly what we're going to talk about today is behavior. So the theme of my book is basically found in answering these questions. What is biological sex? What does that mean? And I'm talking about maleness, femaleness, etc. What is gender? And how is that different from sex? And these are things that lots of fields have definitions of. And in fact, I was in a conversation earlier today. We're still working out how to define these terms and where the boundaries are. What is sexuality, sexual attraction, sexual orientation? What does that mean for an animal? And where did that come from in our species? And what is monogamy and pair bonding, relationships? And what are the rules and where do they come from? And how do other animals navigate the tricky rules around sexual behaviors within a relationship? And then, of course, in chapter 5 of the book, and these are organized by the chapters, I talk about the purpose of sex. Why do we have sex? The various reasons why animals have sex. And, some of it's surprising to us, but a lot of it will be quite familiar because humans have sex for a whole variety of reasons. Occasionally, it leads to procreation, but as I'm sure all of you can relate, sex does a lot more than just create new individuals. And so that opens up really the most fundamental question of all when it comes to talking about sex, and that is, what is the purpose of sex? Why does it exist? And I pose that to the crowd. What's the purpose of sex? Why do we have it? Why does it exist? And I'll spare anyone the embarrassment of venturing an answer, but I imagine a lot of you, the first word that came to mind is reproduction. Generally, when I have a room full of audience members, people are very eager to offer that answer of reproduction. And I'm here to tell you, no, that is not the purpose of sex. And I know that's a bold claim, so let me explain where I'm coming from. First of all, as I said before, think about all of the times in your life that you've had sex. How many of those were procreative? How many of those had anything to do with reproduction? A very small percentage of the time. In fact, for many of us, the number is 0, right? So we have sex for a whole lot more reasons than just reproduction. And I use this as a joking example, but actually the same is true in animals. Animals are constantly having sex, and only rarely in most species does that actually lead to procreation. But believe it or not, that's not even what I'm talking about. The purpose of sex is not reproduction. The reason why I say that is reproduction existed on this planet. Animals and other creatures were reproducing for about 2 billion years before sexual reproduction ever evolved. Sexual reproduction is the second mode of reproduction, if you will, that evolved on this planet, and asexual reproduction existed long before. And asexual reproduction is actually more productive if your only output is reproduction. Actually, asexual reproduction will beat sexual reproduction in a head-to-head competition every time. It's way more efficient. It's way quicker. It's less costly. It's less risky. And you can do it all by yourself. So asexual reproduction is actually far better than sexual reproduction if the goal is reproduction. So I come back to that question then. If the purpose isn't reproduction, what is the purpose of sex? And there is an answer to this. There is a reason why sex evolved when reproduction was never a problem, right? Asexual reproduction was doing just fine. So why did sex evolve? And many of you probably now know where I'm going. And the answer is, of course, diversity. The reason why sexual reproduction has become so favored over asexual reproduction is because it produces genetically unique individuals. And so 2 genomes recombine into a random collection of those 2 genomes into a new genome. And that feature of sexual reproduction, that is the power. That is the purpose of sex, is to combine genes into new combinations, because diversity is the ultimate goal of life in many ways. And we are constantly, I refer to humans and all animals as diversity generating machines. Through mutations and recombination that's happening, we're always recombining our features into new combinations in the next generation. And sexual reproduction requires that recombining in order to have the reproduction. Well, this begs the question, why is diversity so important? Who cares? If you're very well suited for your environment, cloning ought to be good enough, right? Because to make more individuals that are also very well suited, you would think that would be the way to go. The problem with that line of thinking is the environment is constantly changing. There is no one way to be best at anything. No matter how good you are, how well suited you are from your environment, as soon as the environment changes, you're in trouble. And so diversity evolved and emerged in living things as a way to have an insurance plan against a future that you can't possibly predict. There's no way to know what will be the best combination of traits or genes in the future. And so by scattering it all up and shuffling the deck every single generation, what you have is the best possible insurance plan, so that some individuals will have the right combination to survive whatever the challenge is around the corner. And I give you this long monologue about diversity because what I've said is nothing new. Biologists have known this for over a century. It's been very well established that the purpose of sexual reproduction is that generation of new forms, new combinations, new traits, and the spreading of those traits and the unlinking of those traits. We've known that for a long time, that the insurance plan against that uncertain future is diversity. And that's why sexually reproducing creatures become so much more complicated and sophisticated and elaborate. That's what sexual reproduction allows. But for some reason, diversity of sex is only now being appreciated, because diversity everywhere else has long been appreciated, and sex's role in that diversity has always been appreciated. But turning the lens back on sex itself, that's where we're in new ground. And it's a very exciting time to be a biologist interested in diversity, because we are increasingly finding the power of diversity in a population. And we'll talk a little bit about that diversity today. Before I get into the weeds of all this, I need to acknowledge the founder, in many ways, or the pioneer of this field of sexual diversity, gender diversity in nature, and that is Joan Roughgarden. Joan Roughgarden has been ringing this bell for 25 years, and most famously in the publication of her book, Evolution's Rainbow, which came out 21 years ago this year, and was a bombshell in the evolutionary biology community, and it's still rippling through, and we're still contending with all of the many implications of the insights. So I often think that my book is sort of a follow-up to Evolution's Rainbow, with more examples and more packaging, and hopefully for a new audience. But I do have to give credit where credit is due. Most of these ideas really first originated in the brilliant mind of Joan Roughgarden. So I give her all due credit. And I hope that you'll continue to follow. She's actually getting more active again. She's retired. She's been retired for more than 10 years, but she's starting to get more active in public life. So you'll be seeing more essays from her coming out shortly. So let's talk about sex. Let's talk about biological sex. That's the best place to start. Something as simple as maleness and femaleness and all of that. Well, right off the bat, nature gets very creative. And the purpose of all of the examples I'm about to give you now is not, by the way, to draw any direct parallels to humans. Humans, we have our own form of diversity. But the reason why I open my book with a chapter that's all about the complexity of what it means to be male or female is because this complexity has emerged and evolved lots of times in lots of different lineages. We tend to think of our chromosomal XY system as universal. It is far from universal. There are lots of different ways in which sperm and egg get created in an animal body, and what that means and how it bears on that animal body is anything but universal. There's lots of creative examples here. So let's start off with one that's probably fairly well known to some of you. I usually ask the audience the question of, you see this seahorse giving birth. Does anyone want to take a stab at what the sex of that individual is? And whenever I do that, usually there's always somebody in the crowd who will be quick to remind us that that's actually a male, and that giving birth in seahorses is done by males. And that is, of course, correct. What they have is a brood pouch. Males do. And females deposit their egg inside of the brood pouch where it is fertilized by sperm, and the individuals grow, hatch, continue to grow. So the eggs grow, then they hatch, they continue to grow, and you have a live birth sometime later out of the brood patch of the male. So right off the bat, our old tried and true ideas of maleness and femaleness go out the window when you look at invertebrates. They have a whole creative approach here. And then I also want to take a look at this individual. What sex do you think this individual is? And this is a spotted hyena, if you didn't recognize it. Again, this is an example that many people are most familiar with. But when I ask you what the sex is of this individual, there's a large appendage coming off the abdomen that gives you a clue. And yes, that is a female spotted hyena. And that appendage that I'm circling, well, we might call it a penis. Actually, it's an enlarged clitoris, but it actually qualifies as a penis as well because she urinates through that. The urethra does go through the clitoris in the spotted hyena. They have a highly masculinized body, if we can use that word, because of high circulating testosterone. That enormous clitoris is also used for their sexual intercourse. One goes inside the other, and they actually indeed give birth through that structure. And if you're wondering how they give birth through their clitoris, the answer is painfully. In fact, actually, in first births, something like 40% of spotted hyenas perish in their first birth. If they survive the first birth, they generally have a higher rate, or I should say a lower rate of mortality in subsequent births. But it's very painful. But this is what female looks like in a spotted hyena. This is their approach to femaleness. They are not male mimics. I've heard that being applied to them. Nobody is confused about the sex of these individuals. I also want to give you an example of, this is a moray eel, but like many eels, I want to ask you, do you know the sex of this individual just by looking at it? Well, and this is where a lot of people start to guess, both. Is this hermaphrodite? Well, not quite. Actually, this individual is neither. It turns out that many eel species live basically their entire life as sex unspecified, meaning they make neither eggs nor sperm, but they retain the potential to make both. And what happens is, right at the end of their natural lifespan, when they're ready to reproduce, they will make either egg or sperm. And that decision is made based on population density in the local area. So if there's a lot of other eels around, they tend to favor male development. If there are very few other eels around, they tend to make eggs and female development, if you will. And so they're very flexible and adaptable approach to sex determination. It has nothing to do with genes or chromosomes. So that's another way that this can be approached in animals. Let's give another example. Let's continue on with our marine animals. So this is a proboscis worm, a flatworm, and a very ancient lineage of animals. And do you know the sex of this individual? Not male, not female. This is both. So this is a truly hermaphroditic animal. In this case, a simultaneous hermaphrodite. So these particular animals have both penises and vulvas. They can make both egg and sperm, and they do so simultaneously. Interestingly, their courtship is quite interesting because they still will pair up to reproduce. And you might wonder, well, if they can make egg and sperm, why do they even bother to find any other individuals? They can do it all by themselves. Well, to that, I would retort, well, so can we, but it's a lot more fun with somebody else, right? Even it's a wrong chapter of the book, wrong chapter. But the point is that if they do engage in self-fertilization, they've lost the whole purpose of sex, which is diversity, remember. So they go out of their way to really avoid selfing, which is the short for self-fertilization. In fact, all animals that are hermaphroditic go to great lengths to never self-fertilize, because that does not increase genetic diversity. It actually it would have genetic diversity, and that would be a very, very bad idea. But in a pinch, it will work. So if an animal is isolated for a very long time, they will often engage in self-reproduction just in order to keep their lineage going. But what does happen in the courtship of these worms when they find each other is fascinating, because their courtship, their sexual interaction is not just a squirt and go, which would be fine, right? That would work, right? Because they could just release their eggs from their vulva and their sperm from their penis, and that would be it. They actually have two penises. Two penis would be the Latin plural there. So what do? Well, in this courtship, these worms get together and they engage in what looks like a fight, a contest of sorts. And the only appendage they have is their two penises. So it looks like a sword fight with two swords, like a battle that goes on. And you might be wondering, what's the purpose of this battle? Especially because what happens is the victor gets to be the male, if you will. They'll get to use their sperm to inseminate the vulva of the vanquished party. What purpose is that? Who cares about being male or female in an arrangement like that, considering you're putting your genes together with this other individual, no matter if you win or lose? So what is the purpose? Well, it turns out that this courtship competition isn't always completed. It begins and sometimes comes to fruition and sometimes not. And so scientists believe this is a proxy quality control contest. Individuals want to know that they're mating, that they're throwing their genetic lottery in with a high quality mate. They prefer to mate with high quality mates. That's who they want to join their genes with. And so this courtship, if you will, is a competition. And if you're vanquished, that means you found an excellent partner. And so that's how mating goes in these flatworms. This is a Deloid rotifer. Deloid actually begins with the letter B, but the B is silent. And this is a species of animal. These are animals. They're microscopic, but they are true animals. And they reproduce purely by parthenogenesis. This species is only females. There are no males. They have completely ditched males altogether, and they reproduce through parthenogenesis, which is the development of an unfertilized egg. Not quite cloning. It is asexual because there's not two genomes being combined, but it's also not cloning because the eggs are the product of meiosis. So there is a shuffling that goes on but it's very limited, and probably this is a pretty dead end for them. As you can tell, rotifers are not a dominant creature, but they have another way to approach sex and reproduction. You may have heard of clownfish. Well, you've all probably heard of clownfish from the movie Finding Nemo. Well, they have an interesting approach to sex determination as well. I don't know if you saw the movie Finding Nemo, but the movie begins with the mother of Nemo being lost at sea and being killed, I believe. And the rest of the movie is Marlin, the father, looking for his son Nemo, who was swept away by ocean currents. And well, turns out if this movie had been biologically accurate, the father, Marlin, actually would have transitioned to female by the time he reached Nemo. He would have been Marlena by that time, because it turns out that clownfish are all born male. Every clownfish is born as a male, and only rarely does an individual become female. When that individual is the oldest and largest in the group, they become female, and then they breed with the next oldest and largest, which is a male. So you have a breeding pair and a series of ranked males. When the female is lost, the largest male becomes the female, and they all move up in rank and wait their turn. Once again, you might wonder, what is this strange system? Well, this is a method of quality control. It is their method of quality control, because you have to have really good genes and be in really great shape in order to survive to reach the top of the pecking order. And by restraining their own reproduction, they don't overproduce and poison the home that they live in, which is the sea anemone that you see right here. These are very poisonous small sea anemones, and the clownfish are impervious to that. So they have a nice protective home. Nobody can get them. No predators can get them in their home, because they'd be stung to death if they did. But they can't over reproduce, or they would poison their own dwelling. And so their way of restraining their own growth into this hierarchy of reproduction is their way of doing it. The other thing is that when Marlena found Nemo, if it had been biologically accurate, they would have begun to breed and set up their own. So again, probably not a good idea that it was that it be biologically accurate, but that is how the social structure works in clownfish. So here's a Komodo dragon I'd like to introduce you to. I forgot the name. I forgot her name, but she was living in the Chester Zoo in the UK, and she was kept on her own for several years, which you should not do with a social species. It's not healthy or good for a creature to be completely on their own when they are social in nature. Well, she was living on her own for some time, and she suddenly laid an egg, and she incubated this egg, and a perfectly formed female hatched from it sometime later, and she had given virgin birth by the process of parthenogenesis. So, and this was in a zoo, but otherwise she was in no way manipulated with chemicals or genes or anything. And this is an example of something we are discovering more and more, even in vertebrates. We've known this can happen in invertebrates for a long time, but in vertebrates, we're finding more and more examples of creatures that can reproduce through unfertilized eggs, doubling their chromosomes and developing. And again, this does not generate diversity, so it is a rare phenomenon. It's a last-ditch effort, and that is why this is only typically observed in captivity. And that's kind of the point, is that an animal has found itself at what it perceives to be a dead end, and so it's better than nothing to generate offspring by parthenogenesis. And we who knows how many more vertebrates are capable of this. And another dragon, so that was a Komodo dragon. We have now a bearded dragon. So it turns out that bearded dragons, like many reptiles, have a temperature override with their sex determination, and that when temperatures become elevated, they'll actually switch from male to female. It's thought that this is a response to catastrophic environmental conditions, and so the generation of more females allows a population to rebound more quickly. Climate change is, of course, messing with this whole system, and so sex determination and sexual reproduction in many temperature-sensitive animals is being disrupted, and it's an open question whether or not they can adapt fast enough to tolerate this. I tell you all these examples not to say that there's any direct correlates with human sex determination, but I am here to say is look at how disparate these examples are throughout all different kinds of animals. And they've all approached sexual reproduction in an entirely different way. Some of them have diverse forms within their species, and there aren't a lot of hard rules. And remember that each one of these systems had to have evolved. And so it had to have emerged at one point and been thought as it first emerged as unusual or freakish or whatever. But it was in the process of this evolution of something new, that something creative and innovative, and importantly, environmentally responsive. And one of the themes of my book is that this is sexual diversity, but we're going to talk about gender diversity in a minute. Gender diversity and sexual diversity are often a reservoir of resilience that animals have, again, for this future that they can't possibly predict. And so by having multiple forms and a variety of means of reproduction, has a built-in system that when things go haywire in the environment, as they inevitably will from time to time, it gives the creatures the best chance of surviving. So that's how I talk about sex in this book, which is the more simple kind of egg, sperm, male, female, in this format that we're all kind of familiar with, even when there are surprises. But I also want to talk about gender. Yes, gender in animals. And this is where Joan Roughgarden really pioneered our understanding of using the term gender towards animals, which I know a lot of social scientists and anthropologists aren't quite on board with this use of gender. But the way that Joan talks about gender, and that I will, at least for this chapter, is that gender talks about diversity within a species. So even within the same species, there can be multiple ways to be male and multiple ways to be females. And I think, to be honest, this was Joan's very big contribution to the field, because dominating the field of evolutionary biology and field biology still to this day is what we call optimization thinking, that there is one optimal way to be a male, and all males are trying to be that. And there's one optimal way to be a female, and all females really want to be that. And evolution, kind of natural selection, picks off all that aren't good enough. And it's really just stabilizing selection, as we call for these male and female forms, that there's really just two kinds of bodies, male and female, and there's an optimal way to be each of those. Well, I'm here to tell you, as Joan has been telling us for decades, it's just not true. What we see in nature is a variety of forms, even within the sexes. I'll just give a couple of examples here. So I'm going to talk about that example right now, but I'll talk about it in a minute. Well, everyone knows that female lions do not have manes, except when they do. So it turns out that in different groups, the numbers vary from 5 to 10%, but females with manes appear in lions all the time, fairly regularly. And we have no idea why. Why? Because no one has bothered to really study this. But we know that it is an alternate female form that happens often enough that if optimization thinking was right, it should have cleared the deck, right? So stabilizing selection is supposed to remove inoptimal variation, but instead, this is a persistent morph that we see in female lions all the time. Did you know that bluegill sunfish, these are the most abundant fishes in freshwater lakes and streams in North America, these fishes actually come in 3 different flavors of males. The males can be small, medium, or large, and they live differently, they look differently, they have different morphologies, they have different life histories, and while the small ones will grow up to be the medium ones, neither of them become the largest ones. These are a different kind of male. And this is why Joan Roughgarden says there are 4 genders of sunfish. There's 1 type of female and 3 type of male. One thing I will say is Joan might be underestimating this. There might be a lot more going on with the females. And as Lucy Cook has written, and I'll be talking about her later, we actually very much understudy females in almost all species, but definitely female variation. Almost all of the research attention has been on males. So we understand a little bit more about male diversity than female diversity, but it might be there waiting to be found. Let's talk about ruffs. So this is a creature I'll spend a little bit more time on in a minute. There's actually 3 varieties of males in ruffs as well. They're not correlates of these 3. It's totally different. And their morphologies, as you can see, This is a feeder male, this is a satellite male, and these are the territorial males. They are marked differences, and they live differently, they act differently. One is territorial and mutually aggressive, and the others are not. And in fact, they're well tolerated even by those other males. And they perform different ecological roles as well as different social roles. And this is stable for at least as long as we can tell in rough. And we think it goes back at least 500,000 years because the genetics has been worked out in this. So for at least 500,000 years, this diversity is maintained in the population. So once again, if there was just one optimal way to be a male, it wouldn't take but 10 or 20 generations to purify out all of the variety. But that's not what we see. This variety is maintained, in this case, for 500,000 years. And we're lucky enough to know that with these roughs because the genetics has been done. But how many more species will we find this and then slowly start to tease out the genetics? Here's another one where we do understand the genetics. I love these examples because we have taken the time to understand them. So this is the white-throated sparrow, and they come in two morphs, tan-striped and white-striped. The tan-striped is larger, more musical, and territorial and fairly mutually aggressive to one another, whereas the white stripes are much more parental. They give more parental care, and they're much better at food provisioning. So you can think of the white striped morph as the domestic partner, and the tan striped one as the more aggressive, territorial, homemaking morph. And they prefer each other. They will pair up almost exclusively in opposite morphs. But these are not sex morphs. These are not sexes. These are not sex morphs. And in fact, males and females can be either tan or white striped. Males can and females can, and they still prefer each other because the partnership works best when there's one of each type. And it is completely decoupled from sex. So you'll have male-male pairs, female-female pairs, male-female pairs. As long as it's one tan and one white striped, they get along just fine. And again, they've been doing this for maybe not millions of years, but for quite a long time. And we do understand the genetics of it because there's a super gene that's been created that collects the genes for the morphology and the behavior as in one group. So they don't get unlinked, they get fixed together. And now you have these two forms. The paper in Nature where this was presented had a commentary, and they said the four sexes or four genders, if you will. However you want to think about it, Joan would call those four genders. But however you think about it, there's a variety of morphs, and these morphs have been maintained. And it's a system that works for these birds. So just to put a little bit more detail on the rough example, let me check the time. I don't want to. I'm doing okay. So in the rough example, roughs live in leks. So leks are these territories that have no purpose other than reproduction. So they're where all the courtship kind of takes place. And a male tries to dominate the largest territory that he can as a proxy indicator of his strength and vigor. They don't use the territories for anything after that. In fact, the females, once they get inseminated, are gone, and the males actually don't do any parenting. But interestingly, the variety of males, which is stable over time, have important roles. And the thing is the satellite males, the ones with the big bright ruffs here, will often court some of the independent males. And when they have this, and independence meaning unpaired, and they'll prefer higher ranks just as well. And then together they work in order to court females. So what you'll find is females prefer leks that have a lot of birds in them. So they like having a lot of males. So some part of this variety probably just promotes female choice for a populous lek. But you also find that females like large territories. And if they can't find a large territory male, they prefer males that are already mated with another male. And probably because they're going to diversify the genetics of their clutch by having sex or being inseminated by both males. So they want the large male, but they're fine with two lesser males, if you will. And I don't want to use that term. I'm doing it somewhat in jest. But the point is that there's a lot of different ways to be successful as a rough. And the females recognize this as well, knowing that these features will be passed on to their own sons. And as I said, we've actually worked out the genetics of this in roughs, and we perfectly understand how that super gene works in associating both the morphology or the phenotype and the behavior. They're linked in this case, which you don't often see in sexual reproduction. In fact, the point of sexual reproduction is to unlink traits, but this is a case where they've linked them together, and you have these these stable morphs over time. And again, if one had an enormous advantage over the others would disappear. And that's just not what we see. And in fact, as you can see, this inversion happened about 3.8 million years ago, and then came to its current form about 500,000 years ago. And so we know that this has been stable at least that long. White-throated sparrows, once again, it's a super gene that recombination has been suppressed. So that's why you have them linked together. And that's why we know as much as we do about these sparrows with 4 sexes. So I put these papers up in case anyone is a scientist and wants to read more. It's all there and accessible. And many of these are open source. If not, I'll be happy to send you the papers. This is I just want to show you an example of how scientists, even as they were discovering this diversity, didn't quite know how to describe it or detail it. So when the 3 flavors of bluegill sunfish were discovered in the 1980s, which is kind of remarkable considering that we'd been studying them in one way or another for, I don't know, 200 years before we noticed that actually something like 40% of the males don't fit the typical mold. But remember, we were so focused on what we consider to be the apex, the pinnacle kind of male. The fact that 40% of them don't fit the mold just didn't occur to anyone. This wasn't malicious. There was no bad acting here. It was just optimization dominated how biologists studied the natural world. They wanted to study the perfect male, the pinnacle of males, and in doing that they missed the fact that a big chunk of them actually live an entirely different lifestyle and will never turn into them. But when they were discovered, do you know what they named them? They named them cuckolds. So these are cuckold males. And you can see that's a pejorative. It's got all kinds of judgment and moral judgment baked into it. When actually I think this is slowly starting to fade, not as fast as it should. What we're seeing is that it's actually just a different male morph. There's no deception going on. There's certainly competition, but why is one a cuckold and one a parent? I don't really know how that works in fish, especially when you consider that, the largest males do a lot of tending to the eggs, and we can talk about that a certain amount. But when you look at the spawning groups of these sunfish, you can see that 85% of them are a large male with a single female. So that's sort of the expected, the only variety that was really studied. But what you see is another 15% with different combinations. And what you find is that a pretty stable percentage of the pairings are one large male with one medium male. And it turns out that courtship actually, I used to have the numbers on this, but that courtship actually happens before the females arrive. So the males arrive about 2 weeks to the spawning area, 2 weeks before the females do, and they build the nests and they do all the jockeying for, there's a whole bunch. It's like a lek again, where they have a territory, except for this time they actually do build a nest. And the best nest is the largest one right in the middle, so because it has the protection from the periphery where you can get egg predators and things. So the most desirable nest is right in the middle and of course largest. Well, every male can't be that male, right? So some of the males actually pair up with each other, a large and a medium. The large and the large can't pair with each other because they're too mutually aggressive. They don't trust one another and they'll fight. But a large with the medium does just fine. And so if they're along the peripheries, they might have a suboptimal nest location, but the fact that there's 2 of them is attractive to females. So the females like the large solo guys in the middle, but not everybody can be that. So another way to be successful is to be around the periphery and guard your nest with 2 males as well. And what you see then is a stable diversity of sexual forms in the sunfish. This goes on and on throughout this chapter where I discuss other creatures. The Western Marsh Harrier is one in which there are at least 2 main morphs of male. And I introduced this example because the scientists who study it just couldn't help themselves in describing the lesser male as a female mimic. Now, I'm being a little bit mean to these scientists because I don't think they were intending this as nasty as I took it. But when you have a male that doesn't behave in the way that we expect males to be, scientists tend to call them female mimics. And I think this comes down to the commitment to have the two buckets of there's a one way to be a male, one way to be a female. And if a male doesn't fit his bucket, well, there's only one other bucket he could be. So he has to be pretending to be a female. Let me rest assured and tell you, these Western Marsh Harriers are not pretending to be females. The birds themselves are not fooled by this. And I explain in great detail why I think that's a very bad hypothesis. But they did this experiment and they found that the males will attack a male decoy way more often than a female decoy. And if the male decoy looks like a female, they won't attack it as much as they will the male decoy that looks like a male. And then this is one experiment. This is literally the only chart of data that supports their conclusion of female mimicry. But actually, their own papers throughout their lifetime of studying these birds actually describes a great deal of diversity in how these females and females look. So these were the males that they identified as such in other articles. These were the females, and these are the male mimics. The only thing that's really, the female mimics, that really puts these males in a category with other females is that they have light coloring on the top of their head. That's really the only female mimic look that they would have. They are the same size as the other males, which is 40% smaller than the females. So 40%, right? It's a very big difference, right? So they're the same size. And you'll also notice that they have yellow eyes like the other males do here. So nobody is confused about the sex of these individuals. And in fact, the same research group a couple of years after that paper published a great deal about the incredible variety of these birds. And in fact, using their own words, the brown female-like plumage was a wide and seemingly continuous range of plumage variation between female-like and male, and sexing adults purely by plumage color is unreliable. And in fact, they go on to say, barely a single adult male looks like the typical field guide male. So they sort of admit that you can't tell the sex of these things just by looking at their plumage. Yet they have a whole paper saying that that's exactly what they do to fool each other. You can't make this stuff up. But anyway, what's really going on is that you have probably three kinds of males in these Western Marsh Harriers. You have the big dominant guys right here, and they build the nests, and they're very territorial, and they guard their nests very well. But there's other behaviors that males can do besides building nests. They engage in something called mobbing, where if a egg predator is noted is like a badger or a rat or any small rodent or a snake even that can eat the eggs of these guys, these mobbers will call out, and a group of them, females and these other males, will get together and root out the egg predator. And there's different kinds. There's detectors, there's recruiters, and this mobbing behavior is not found in the big guys, right? And so they can't be bothered with shooing out the predators because they're too busy guarding territory from each other. But that's actually okay because the other males pick up the slack and they gain a certain amount of paternity. The point is there's a variety of males in Western Marsh Harriers, and this is stable over time, and they each play an important ecological role. And you can see here where it says the gray males tend not to be involved in mobbing and almost never behave as recruiters or mobbers, while the brown males behave mainly as recruiters. The point is they have an ecological role. They are important to their species. They're just a little different than our expectations. And they don't, these decoys that they had does nowhere near capture the diversity that we see in there. Now, I want to end this section on gender by bringing up an example from a species a little bit closer to home. So we are primates, we are apes, and gender diversity is a little bit more controversial as you get into the creatures that are more like us. I want to introduce you to this chimpanzee named Donna, and she's a female in the sense that she has female anatomy, but she doesn't behave much like a female. She doesn't behave like a typical male either. She's actually quite different. So males, in this, we were introduced by Franz de Waal, and many of you will know who he is, who he was. Sadly, he passed last year. But probably outside of Jane Goodall, probably the next most influential primatologist that's ever lived, and an absolute expert on chimpanzee and bonobo behavior. Well, he introduces us to this chimpanzee named Donna in his book, Different. And what Donna is all about is, so males in chimpanzees actually are fairly aggressive, fairly fairly nasty to one another. Actually, it's a very hierarchical social structure that chimpanzees have, very dominance oriented, kind of violent. There are a lot of skirmishes, and privilege and rank is everything. So a dominant male has a lot of privileges, feeding privileges, sexual privileges, social privileges, and there's a lot of jockeying for position. And the females endure a lot of harassment from the males. So females are lower down the rank always, except Donna. This chimpanzee Donna moves in and out of social circles without harassment, really isn't in the dominance game. She doesn't try to climb the ladder, but yet she's respected by all. And the reason why is that Donna is asexual. She has no interest in sex and never has. She plays a role of social facilitator and she reconciles conflicts. She has a lot of important social roles in her group. Now, it remains to be seen how common this is. And if it is genetic, it wouldn't get passed on. Asexual animals aren't going to reproduce. So it could be a one-off. But the point is that you have an example of gender diversity in the chimpanzee that was important to the group, that was valued by the group, that was respected. And she enjoyed a high position in her group, despite being female, which isn't common in the common chimpanzee. So I'm running out of time. So I just want to preview. This is kind of what I'm talking about in the first two chapters. And then I finally get into same-sex sexual behavior. And I call that chapter "That's Gay," just to be funny. And I open it with this story. So there was a tourist, a British tourist, who was on safari in Africa, and he saw this and couldn't believe it. Took a picture of two male lions having sex, and he couldn't believe it. Took the picture, went back to Britain, and the Independent wrote a story about this. They were so stunned by the fact that two male lions would have sex. Well, you know who doesn't seem to be bothered at all by this is the female that's sitting right here. And the reason why is that male-male sex in lions is not at all uncommon. Actually, it's quite common. And lions, there's a lot of mythology around lions. And in some lion prides, you really do have a single male, and then a harem of females. But actually, most lion prides have multiple males, multiple females. And they're led by what you would call a coalition of males. And that's what it's called. You have 3, 4, 5 males. And they do have rank. That's a very dominance-oriented society as well. But these males get along and they live together and they support one another and they have a lot of sex with each other. And they tend to spend most of their time in sex-segregated groups. So the females are over here, the males are over there, and they're all having sex with each other. And then they will come together when the females are in estrus for procreative purposes, but most of their sex life is actually with their own sex. And you might wonder, well, why would the males do this? Well, it sure beats fighting, right? Because if your way of determining dominance is through a fight to the death, well, that's, even if you win, you're injured, right? It's an injurious way to do that. Whereas sexual struggles or competitions are actually much safer, and they build social cohesion and harmony. And it does kind of look like Greco-Roman wrestling. There is an attempt to dominate. That's what the sex and social life is like for lions. But the point is it is sex. It's penetrative. They climax and all of that. It's sex in all of the ways that we would consider a sex act sex. But let me tell you, besides just how ignorant this is, the other thing that annoys me about pictures like this is that this is the picture they show when same-sex sexual behavior is discussed, something like this. But same-sex sexual behavior just as often or more often looks like this, right? It's two animals that are in a pair bond. They have affectionate contact, not just sexual contact. They're each other's best friends and main social partners. It's affiliative, not just sexual, right? It's not just about the fucking, right? It's about the relationship and what they get out of it. And animals can be very affectionate with each other, and including in same-sex partnerships. So in the book, I go through all kinds of examples, and I don't have time to do this now, but I go through all examples of same-sex partnerships, whether it's just same-sex behavior, just the sex act, and I discuss that first. But then I talk about stable partnerships. So these are two albatrosses right here that will probably, and two females, and they will probably mate for life, as most albatrosses do. And I talk about these bed bugs here, these garter snakes here, and these flower beetles here that are engaging in same-sex sexual behavior. And I chose those 3 examples because they are fairly antisocial sexual behaviors, meaning they're manipulative, they're also injurious, and they are attempting to get the better of their sexual partner. So this is not a pro-social sexual act. And I use that as an example to say sex can be a weapon, sex can be a tactic, sex can be used to climb the social ladder, sex can be used as a commodity. It is traded for resources quite commonly in the animal world, including in primates. And so same-sex sexual behavior is part of that. And I use this, the next chapter that I have after I cover partnerships and pair bonding, I talk about all the reasons why animals have sex, what they gain from it, the benefits of sex, and once you establish that there's so much that an animal can gain from sexual activity and sexual relationships, it would be quite unusual if all the animals were heterosexual, if they were only opposite sex attracted, because then you'd have all of the missed opportunities of having sex with those of the same sex. Now, that also begs the question, do you have exclusively homosexual animals or exclusively heterosexual? What we see in nature generally in social animals is a lot of basically bisexual or pansexual, whatever you want, where the sex of the other partner really isn't the main issue that concerns. The only time when you have a pretty strictly heterosexual animal is in the solitary species. So there are a few mammal species that live very solitary lives as adults. Orangutans are our closest relatives that live like this. And orangutans do live almost exclusively on their own as adults, especially the males. And so you don't see same-sex sexual behavior in that species. And they're the exception that proves the rule. So when there aren't a lot of social benefits, you don't see this behavior. But for all of the animals that live together in groups, you do see a lot of same-sex sexual behavior, and for interesting reasons. And I had a lot of fun with that chapter because there's a lot of surprising reasons why animals have sex with each other. So I go through all these, and I finally do, towards the end, get around to talking about the strangest animal of all, which is the human being. And I finally, at the very, very end, I tell you what I really think, which I can't tell you today because then you wouldn't buy the book, and I would have defeated my own purpose in being here. But thank you very much for your time and attention. And I do want to point out that, Joan Roughgarden and I aren't the only ones writing about this. There are a lot of really good books that I recommend that expand on these topics, some of which I cite in my book. Some have come out since my book, so I couldn't have mentioned them. But 2 of them I really want to recommend. Cap O'Hannon, who wrote a book that really talks about how evolution has shaped the human body through shaping the female human body. So much attention has been paid to the male body as the kind of perfect specimen of humanity, but actually the female body and its role in evolution affects us all, because almost all of our genes are shared between the sexes. So something that affects females affects all of us in the evolutionary game. The other book I want to point out, as I mentioned before, is Bitch by Lucy Cook, which talks about the extreme underrepresentation of females, even in animal research. We know this from medical research that males get all the attention and are the sort of standard form of the human body. But actually, it even extends to animal research, animal behavior research. Researchers have spent so much time obsessing over what the males are doing that they've overlooked a lot of really interesting biology in the female of the species. And so Lucy Cook is trying to set the record straight there and encourage more research on that. So I really recommend both of these books. But all of these books are fantastic, and they will change your thinking about sex and gender. And I really hope that that you'll take the time to read some of them. And I do want to end by just saying that I'm not going to kid myself and pretend I have no dog in this hunt. We are living in a time in which sexual diversity and gender diversity is very much under threat and of oppression and suppression. I will say that I wrote this book prior to the election of 2024 at a time when I thought that gender diversity was sort of ascendant and was becoming more accepted, more tolerated, and more celebrated. We seem to have given away all of those gains, and we're going to have to fight back again. But I do just want to remind you that the diversity that we see in animals, we also see in our own species. And we'll have our own kind of diversity, just like ruffs and bluegill and lions. Humans have our own form of sexual diversity and gender diversity. And there's a whole wide spectrum of gender expression, of relationships and family forming. And all of them are perfectly normal and natural and in keeping with 500 billion years of experimentation and adaptation and flexibility around diversity of sex and sexual reproduction. And so to any queer people who happen to be listening to this talk or reading the book, I hope you know that there is nothing wrong with you. You are perfectly normal, natural, and should be celebrated for the variety that you add to our species. And we're so happy to have you among our species, helping to make it a more colorful world. So I would be happy to take any questions that you have. That's all I have for prepared remarks, but I think you can put questions either in the chat or otherwise. And I do have some time. I'd be happy to take some questions.
So that was a fascinating talk. I just finished your book yesterday, and I absolutely loved it, and I can't recommend it anymore.
Thank you, Greg. I really appreciate that. Thanks.
I have one question while we're waiting. So you talked about the Virunga band of gorillas in your book,
Mm-hmm.
and you talk about the fact that they're a peaceable band, unlike other bands of gorillas. So I was wondering if bands ever cross each other's paths, and if the Virunga band interacted with another band, would we anticipate the other band maybe adopting some of their culture, or some culture cross? I guess contamination isn't quite the word I'm looking for.
It's a great question. I'm sure that they would influence one another. But for those who haven't read the book, I want to fill them in on what you're talking about. So again, there's this perception that gorillas always live in these very small groups of a single male with 6, 7, 8 females. And what they call a harem lifestyle. And that's the family and the offspring of those females with that male, and that's it. And when that male gets deposed, the new male comes in, kills all of the children to bring the females into heat. And that happens. Of course, that's what Diane Fossey first described and primatologists have been describing. But it turns out that for now, going on 20 years, there is a group, and it's not just a single family now. It's a multi-family group of multi-male, multi-female groups. Individual groups can get as large as 60 members in some of these, and the males just aren't leaving anymore. So normally when a male grows up and he gets sort of teenage years, he's got to go because he's a threat to his dad. But in this group, they're just not. They're living peacefully and harmoniously, and they're tolerating each other. The two males, the multiple males, they're not close partners. They're definitely like, but they tolerate each other, their social behaviors and their sexual behaviors. And what that tells us is that this isn't irreversible. Like these lifestyle, the way that these animals live is flexible and adaptable, and it can change. So it may be that they move in and out of different social arrangements when the environment allows. Could be that these gorillas, having been protected in this preserve, and they're not dying by poaching and hunting as often, that changes the way they interact. It could be that the threat actually makes them close in and become more nasty. But when they're living in a more peaceful way, that they're more able to tolerate one another. It could be that that's the reason. We don't know. Now, the question you had was, do intergroup contacts lead to change? We don't know. The short answer is we don't know. It's only been happening for about 20 years, which is barely a full generation in gorillas. But what we do know is it is spreading by itself, meaning that as the group swells in size and the males have much lower mortality now, so they're surviving longer, the group size is swelling, and it seems to be. And then, of course, they do have some fission-fusion dynamics, not as much as chimpanzees, but gorillas do have where groups can fall apart and other ones grow. And so because of the fission-fusion dynamics and the higher male or lower male mortality, it is spreading. But whether it's spreading by social contact or not, I don't think that is known. I certainly don't know the answer, but I don't think it is known.
Okay.
But good question.
Thank you. I'm ready for questions. So Eugenie asked, You've talked about animals that have different family and pair bond configurations, male, male, female, female, in addition to male, female. How much raising of young occur in these families?
Fascinating question. And it's going to be one of those things that is very, very species specific. So some of the examples I can give you, certainly we know that in birds, like seabirds, like albatrosses, the female-female bonds are very purposed towards the rearing of young. So the females take turns laying an egg and getting inseminated and laying an egg. And what's weird about this with albatrosses in particular is albatrosses are genetically monogamous. So they mate for life and they tend to be fairly sexually exclusive with each other, but not the female ones, obviously, because in order to become inseminated, they have to go outside the pair bond. And they do this, they tend to take turns each year because their eggs are huge. So it's very hard for them to handle more than one in a year. And so they do have extra pair copulations, but they are very purposed towards the raising of offspring. So in that case, for sure. Another bird example is the black swans, but also, well, yeah, I'm thinking mostly of Australian black swans, where you have male pairs and they will court a female and have sort of a temporary threesome, if you will. And then when the eggs are laid, when the eggs are laid, the males take over and they do the parental work there. So, but the female stays around until the eggs are hatched, because the incubation period is often the most critical. Someone has to be sitting on the eggs basically all the time in order for them to develop properly and hatch. So the question is, it's a mixed bag. I mean, the answer is it's a mixed bag, but we do see that most of the partnerships, at least in birds, are purposed towards the rearing of offspring. In other kinds of animals, it's a mixed bag. A lot of in mammals, mammals don't pair bond all that much anyway. Only about 9% of mammals form pair bonds at all, but it is 15% of primates, so it's a little bit more common. But what you see in the same-sex sexual behavior is that it's same-sex and opposite. So you don't see a lot of exclusive same-sex behavior. And in a lot of species, males aren't even aware or do they care at all about their offspring, so to speak. So you don't see much parenting as much from males anyway. The most interesting examples, if you ask me, are the mammals that have cooperative alloparenting. So this is where you have species where they all, contribute to the parenting of the offspring in the group without regard for whose children, that they'll kind of do it cooperatively. And if you look at the Barbary macaques, they live, on the north coast, the Barbary coast of Africa. These macaques, they still pair up, but the pairing up doesn't have anything to do with reproduction. They do kind of care for offspring together. And in fact, two males, as part of their courtship, will often one will hand a child to the other, and they'll kind of parent together for a while. But it's not either of their children, right? So I always often say that's often, I think that's a better example of the human family than some of these nuclear families that you see in primates. They're very rare. There's a couple species of gibbon, and there's the coppery titi in South America, where they form like these tight nuclear families. But I want to use that as an example. So the coppery titi, you have a male, a female, and their offspring, and that's the group. And people use this as an example of the human family, and they try to study it and draw these parallels. I think that's a terrible example of the human family, because they don't interact with any other groups. They're hostile to other groups. So this family lives in complete isolation. Humans do not do that. Human families are intricately linked to other families, right? We send our kids to school and daycare, and we have division of labor, and we live in these very cooperative societies. We don't think of what we do as cooperative alloparenting, but isn't it? I mean, somebody else is caring for your child all day. Yes, you pay them, but the fact that there's a currency exchange, to me, is immaterial. I think we are much closer to Barbary macaques, where we have a cooperative approach to parenting, certainly, than we are to coppery titis.
Okay. Next question. Howard asked, if you have a limit on the degree to which you extrapolate from other animals to humans, what is it?
So I think that my extrapolation to humans is not as much as it sounds. I use human analogies for understanding animal behavior, and just for communicating, and also to keep the prose light. But if I'm speaking, more carefully, I will point out that most of these features are going to be fairly unique to each species. What I see as common is the fact that they all have these kinds of diversity. I'm not saying that our diversity is like the bluegill diversity. I'm not saying that our diversity is like lions or gorillas even. What I'm saying is that all these species have creative approaches to sex, gender, and relationships. And so it would be unusual if humans didn't also have our own form of diversity when it comes to sex, gender, and relationships. I'm very careful not to draw direct parallels with other species in terms of what motivates them and their ecological state and our ecological state. Humans are a very strange creature in the way that we live and the way that we recreate environments. We create our own environments rather than just kind of reacting to it. And even chimpanzees and bonobos, like, those two are sister species. They live very, very different ways. Like, their social lives are very, very different. So I think that people who try to draw direct lines, that's a fallacy, and you have to be careful about that. I think that when I'm celebrating the diversity of other animals, I'm using it as exemplars of diversity, not of specific traits, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Okay. Various skeptics ask, could the Tsavo lions, two maneless male lions who massacred many people in the 19th century, have lost their manes because of gender role switching, i.e. these males hunted while in most cases female? I think they're saying that females are the hunters.
Yeah. In lions, generally, almost all of the hunting is done by females. And the males tend not to engage in much hunting. I'm not sure I understand the question, but if you have a maneless male, which does happen as well, and so I'm not sure I understand how that would. I'm not sure how that connects to gender diversity, other than it does happen. And if they massacred many people in the 19th century, is it that they got away with it more because they didn't have a mane and people weren't as scared? Is that what you mean? Or I'm not quite sure. I mean, I know that the animals will respond to human selective pressures, of course. But did they lose because they were taking on female roles? Okay, well, for example, if the distribution of hair was driven by androgens, by testosterone, it might also be that certain behaviors are driven by estrogen testosterone ratios. So they could go hand in hand, right? It's easy to unlink that, but they could be linked, within a certain group at a certain time. So it could be that what you see in maneless males is that they'll adopt female typical behavior as well. Yes, that could be. I don't know in that particular example, but it could be. And in fact, that's what you do see within a generation. When you see sort of sex atypical behaviors often do associate with morphologies, because they're driven by hormone ratios and things like that will be linked together. But over evolutionary time, we tend to unlink traits. And so traits will go wherever they best fit, and they're not linked to other traits genetically anyway.
Okay, we have one more question. Dredell says, the gender diversity in animals shed light on human diversity, but humans appear unique in trying to manipulate their bodies by surgery, etc. How do you regard this difference?
Okay, well, I mean, I guess what you're getting at there is the transgender identity and the gender affirming care that's associated with that. So again, there are no direct parallels to transgender identity in animals, just because there's no way to even conceptualize what their identity might be. We can observe how animals behave, but we can't ask how they feel. However, again, using the parallels of diverse gender expressions and diverse gendered forms, diverse sexed bodies, and that humans that would have variations on that theme through identity as well as body and as well as any other kind of gender expression, again, that would be expected. It's expected that there is going to be variation on that if we use other animals as our example. So the question then becomes, the individuals who feel discordant, whose experience of their own sex and gender is discordant, what's the problem with them doing what they need to do in order to feel more at peace in their body and to feel that it expresses more of what they feel inside? Because think of all of the other ways that we adorn ourselves and that we alter our own appearance, whether it's cutting our hair and wearing glasses, wearing clothes, all kinds of things like that, which I know is less drastic and less permanent, although there's plenty of cases where it isn't, right? There's cosmetic surgery is a thing, but it's the same. It comes from the same place, which is the idea to express one's inner identity in an outward form. And the reason why that outward form is important is that's what the rest of the world sees, and that's how you interact with the rest of the world. So a transgender individual, the way that they would apply makeup, for example, is going to be different by time period. If you had a transgender individual in classical times, which there's evidence that there were transgender individuals, they don't behave like transgender individuals do now, because masculinity and femininity was different then, right? And it was expressed differently then. And so modern day transgender individuals, many of them, not all of them, many of them feel a discordance with their body as it is. And so there's a desire to make what they show to the world, which is a highly gendered space. You have to remember that gender is created out in society and that we just respond to it, right? And so the way that they express their gender, they want to find more concordance so that they are interacting with the way that they feel represents their gender identity. And increasingly, though, as the world becomes more tolerant of gender fluidity and some of the lines get blurred, what do you see in the transgender population? You see that their approach is no longer, or at least not only, trying to just look the other sex, right? They're taking creative approaches. They're picking and choosing masculine and feminine features because that's more allowed. Whereas if you remember, before the term transgender, we said transsexual, right? There were transsexuals. And for 100 years, there's documented literature on transsexuals. Because the male-female buckets were so separated during those era, transsexual individuals needed to do an entire shift to the other way in order to feel concordant. But now that masculine and femininity have become more blurred, transgender individuals aren't as gung-ho about going all the way fully in the other direction and being taken in the other way. Instead, they're using they them pronouns, for example, and they're mixing masculine and femininity in new and creative ways. And my point is, why would we want to stop them? Who is that hurting? Right? Why let them live their lives? And our response to that should be nothing more than, hey, how can I help you? Like, what because as far as I can tell, they're not trying to hurt anybody else. What they're trying to do is express a diverse sense of masculinity and femininity that they were almost certainly born with.
Well, Dr. Lentz, I wish we had another hour. This talk has been absolutely fascinating. And I hope that you join us again when you decide to write another book, because I would love to hear you speak again.
Thanks very much, Gwen. I appreciate that. High praise.
Thank you for joining us. And I am going to talk about next month's speaker at this point. Our December speaker will be Canadian science teacher Dr. Rodney Schmaltz, speaking on From Ghost Hunts to Pseudoscience Fairs, How to Build Better Skeptics. How do you encourage high school students to be curious and critical thinkers? You take them ghost hunting. Join us on the second Thursday of December 11th at 7:30 p.m. on the Bay Area Skeptics YouTube channel. See you then, and thank you again for joining us this evening. Goodbye.